All right, y'all, here we go. This is MJ from Just Plain Fun, and today we're going to look at the router plane type study. So I'm going to tell you how to identify what type your router plane is, and then give you a little bit of history and backstory on them as well. The information I'm going to provide is from John Walter, his Antique and Collectible Stanley Tools Guide to Identity and Value, and it's going to be specifically the router plane type study. And as you can see, Lars Larson, Jim Price, and Roger K. Smith are responsible for this. All right, let's go ahead and hop right in. This is a Type 2. As much as I wish I could start out with a Type 1, unfortunately I don't have one. But just imagine it looks just like this, but it doesn't have Stanley and it doesn't have number 71 there. That's the only difference between the Type 2 and the Type 1. Both were japanned, both had the maple knobs, both had the two-part construction on the hardware for the knobs. So very similar, just those minor differences between the Type 1 and Type 2. As far as what's specifically annotated in the type study, you've got the checkered design. It is japanned. You've got the patented March 4th, 1884 around the center right here. And that was a patent that was issued to Henry Cope. And he was the original creator of this. Maple knobs, they do have the bead at the base of it that might be kind of hard to see, but your first few types had that. And then two cutters were provided with this originally. It was just the 1/2 inch and then the 1/4 inch. So the witch's tooth that we'll talk about later didn't come until a later model. And then last and certainly not least, the clamp that holds those on it was fluted, is what they call that. Unfortunately, I don't have a japanned one. I don't have an original one to show you, but that'll give you an idea of what it looked like. And just to recap, remember Type 1 did not have the number 71 or the Stanley. Type 2 does have those features. Both of those are japanned. And then Type 3 would have been all of these same features that we just talked about, except the base was nickel plated instead of being japanned. So that covers your first 3 types of the Stanley number 71, and note that they are all with the closed mouth, but they are still a number 71 because this was before they went to the open mouth, which we'll talk about here in just a second. And if you're keeping track at home, Type 1, 1884, 1885, so just a short time, so they are going to be rather uncommon. Type 2, 1885 to 1888, and then Type 3, from 1888 to 1892. Next up is going to be our Type 4s. And we're talking 1892 to 1895. And this was a major design change. So it's going to have all the features of the Type 3, except it is now an open throat router. So the way it's described in the type study is there's an arched bridge that supports the casting forward of the open aperture, or the large aperture. So that's what we're talking about here. But it's now an open faced, and this is what most people think of when they think of or see a number 71. But the name Stanley is separated on the base. So you've got Stan over here and then Lee over here. And the patented, remember on the Type 1 through 3, it was around in a circle here. So now we've moved patented, and then March of 84, we've moved that down to the bottom. And then we've got number 71, which is also separated. And those are the primary features for our Type 4. That bead at the base of the maple knobs has now gone away. And the other difference that they talk about in the type study is we now have a stippled surface. So if you remember, the Types 1 through 3 had the checkered pattern. It's now stippled on the base. For our Type 5s, the main difference that we see here is the addition of the throat closing attachment. And so it's got this extension here on the collar so that you can attach the additional attachment or throat closing attachment there. And then under our Type 5s, which by the way, 1896 to 1901, we also have another way to narrow down the years they were produced. And what that designator is specifically is from 1896 to 1898, they may have an S casting there, and incidentally, they can also be on the attachments themselves. So this one actually has a B, so it's not 100% type correct. Hopefully you can see that there. But the bottom of the collar as well will sometimes have a B or an S there. So that just helps you identify the year that it was made, and then, you know, a little bit more specifics there. And the time frame for our B casting marks per the type study, 1899 to 1901. Moving on to our type 6s, let me go ahead and just throw it out there up front. No, they were not painted blue from the factory, but incidentally, shout out to my friend Steve for letting me borrow this one for the purpose of the video, because, you know, amassing all of these different types of routers just to make this video, not the easiest thing that I've ever done, and certainly not the cheapest thing I've ever done. But our type 6s, 1902 to 1905, had all the same features as the type 5, with the exception of the changes that I'm about to talk about. So, patented October of 01, and that patent specifically refers to the addition of the adjustment screw right here, and this little adjustment nut that moves the blade up and down here. And that was a patent that was issued October 29th of 1901 to Albert Shade, and it is the cutter adjustment provision, if you will. A couple other items from the type study on type 6s that are worth noting is the bolt that attaches these knobs is now typically going to be a one-piece bolt. Looks like so away with the barrel nuts that were on the other ones. This cutter adjustment screw that I talked about, that is now a feature from this point forward on all Stanley planes. So both the 71s and the 71.5s that we'll talk about here in a little bit. And one other thing of note is that some of your type 6s are going to have the Stanley New Britain, Connecticut on top of the blade adjustment nut. Some of them are going to have it, some of them won't. But that's what they look like. And y'all remember the transition on the Type 5 from the S casting mark to the B casting mark? Well, a lot of your Type 6s are going to have a B casting mark on them. So you can look for them right there. And another point that is made in the type study is that a lot of the illustrations that you see in various places are going to have the small part of the collar down, facing down like that. But the authors of the type study wanted to point out that in the Stanley catalogs, all of the illustrations show the smaller portion, the smaller diameter facing up. And then they just point out that you can't get the full range of the cutter with that part facing down. As we go from the type 6s over to the type 7s, I'm just going to put these side by side so you can see the changes here. So our type 6s, remember, Stanley separated, but it's written in that fancy pants lettering there. So we now see block lettering. So it's still separated, but it's up here and it's now in block lettering. We still have the, number 71, but it's repositioned. And then you have the patented October 29th of 01. So that part itself has not changed. And then the type study points out that most of the adjusters for this, the type 7, are going to have the lettering there on the top. Ha! I said the top. Technically that would be the bottom based on what we just talked about. Oh, and the other major difference, as you can see, is going to be these holes right here that are drilled and then also countersunk typically. And that was so that you could attach an auxiliary sole. So you could attach a wooden sole there if you wanted to have wood on wood contact. You didn't want to have to worry about any kind of burrs or edges on the metal. Or if you, wanted to fill that in across the front for the open throat. Whatever the case may be, you could attach a wooden base to it and you wouldn't have to drill a hole in your router to do it. You could just come up with the appropriate size hardware to make that happen. Moving right along to our Type 8s. This guy right here. And that's 1909 to 1915. And it features a major change on this one. And that major change is that the throat closing device, which is this right here, is now mounted on the arched bridge over the throat. So this was a patent that was issued September 10th of 1907. And that was issued to George Bartlett. So previously we had the patented October 29th, 01 right here. That was our only patent date, for our Type 7 specifically, and the Type 6s. But now we've moved that 01 date over here to this side, and we've added the 07 date to signify this addition up here. The number 71 has now been repositioned as well. We do still have the screw holes in the base that are drilled, at the factory and countersunk. And the cast iron base has a checkered design on the surface. So we're back to that. Remember, we had the stippled for a while, so now we're back to the checkered design. And then no more B casting marks on those, by the way. Oh, and I almost forgot. We also now have Stanley written across the top of our throat opening, and that's a reposition as well. And I'm just going to add a little FYI. If you find a router out there in the wild that doesn't have this screw right here, there's a few screws on the Stanley number 45 that are the same thread, and they're close enough that they'll work there in a pinch if you had to. And as a matter of fact, the fence screws on the 55 and 45 actually work on this collar as well. So if you were in a pinch, and the fence screws specifically because they have that tapered end. But just a little FYI to help you out in case you're looking for some parts. Here's our Type 9s, and these were from 1916 to 1924. And no, Stanley did not make them red or red and white from the factory. I'm sure you probably noticed by now that I run an orphanage for wayward routers that don't have any other homes. This one has been altered a bit. The screw here was probably broken or otherwise damaged, so they just lopped it off there at the top. But I assure you, this is a Type 9, just missing that little guy. But it does have all the same features as the Type 8 with some minor changes. So for starters, our 1901 patent date is now eliminated and it's replaced with Made in USA. So you probably remember on this one, 1901, 1907. Well, now 1901 is gone and now it's Made in USA. And then this is actually where we see the introduction of the V-shaped cutters. I haven't really talked too much about the cutters in general, other than mentioning that the early ones only had 2. But with our Type 9s, this is where we see the introduction. And incidentally, the type study talks about the V cutter being a 2-part construction like this, which is what we see right here. So it's got the screw on the bottom. You can actually remove that, and then it should make it easier for you to sharpen the cutter. But I have one that is a 1-piece construction, and if you look at the original patent drawing, at least in my estimation, it shows it as a 1-piece construction. So I'm just going to go ahead and say that the early ones were a 1-piece, and then maybe the 2-piece construction came later. But the type study does mention this patent date that you see on some of the early ones, which is 5/14/1912. That was a patent that was granted to Thomas Sainer, obviously, in 1912. And then it was actually granted to Sainer, but it was actually held by the Stanley Rule and Level Company. All right, we made it to our Type 10s, and this is now 1925 to 1938. So if you remember our Type 9s, we still had the 07 patent date on there. So that patent date is now gone, and we just have Made in USA across the bottom. We still have number 71 written up here. A lot of the other features are the same. And here's the thing, this must be somewhere mid-range or close to the end of the Type 10s, because the Type 10s are not supposed to have these screws, or these screw holes rather, for the fence, which I'm going to talk more about on the Type 11s. But if you eliminate these 2 holes right here, this has all the features of a Type 10. And if that's what you're looking at there in front of you as you're typing your plane, that's what we're going with. And the type study does mention that black paint was used intermittently. So you may have your knobs with black paint on them, like this one right here, during Type 10, or you may not during that time period. So our Type 11s, which are going to be 1939 to 1941, they have all the features of the Type 10, naturally, with a few exceptions, or with some additions, if you will. So the cutters now have a groove on all 4 sides. And that is to engage the adjustment wheel, as you know, but you can actually position these in multiple locations and still be able to engage the cutting wheel So you could actually, you know, turn it around backwards if you had an application for that where you wanted to do that. And then they also added the little graduations on there so that as you're making your fine adjustments with the wheel, you can tell just how far you've moved it there. It's also mentioned that the maple knobs are now going to be painted black. And in 1941 specifically, so at the tail end of what we're calling Type 11, you may actually see rosewood knobs instead of the maple. And then the biggest difference here for this particular model is going to be the addition, and this is now our Type 11s, is going to be the addition or the introduction of the fence. And that's what that looks like right there. So it talks about how you have the machined grooves on the bottom. So that's what aids the fence there in its travel. And then they're typically going to come with a screw that looks like this. And I say typically because unfortunately a lot of times the fence and or the screw are missing. Some folks like to run 2 screws. I do sell these, by the way, just the screw itself. But you really only need 1. That's going to be sufficient to hold that fence in place. And as a woodworker, I'm sure you can imagine where that would be helpful, or where that could be helpful to have that fence. Now, having said that, a lot of times these fences are pristine like this because they get removed from the router when it's first purchased and then never used again. But that's often another story. But it does have the 4 holes for you to put the fence screws in. So you have multiple options there depending on where and how you want to position that fence. But if you can just indulge me for a second here, we'll go back to this one that I was using as a Type 9 example, even though it has the holes. So it's technically not really a Type 9. But the type study also mentions how they do away with the checkered pattern there, and they make this more solid, and that is to support the holes. Well, as you can see, this one does not have it. And so that's another reason that makes it closer to being a Type 9, even though it does have the screw holes for the fence. And last and most certainly not least, you do have number 71 and Made in USA that are repositioned on the base there. Type 12s, 1942 to 1945, those dates should stick out to you, especially if you're into history. And if you're into Stanley history, you know 1942 to 1945 was during World War II, and so you guessed it, Japanning. Instead of having the nickel plating, we're looking for, you know, cheaper wartime features like we have on the bench planes. So they're going to get Japanned instead of having the nickel plating. Early models, i.e. 1942, are going to have rosewood. I mean, I guess you could make the case that this is rosewood. I mean, it's heavily varnished if it is rosewood hiding underneath there. Just doesn't have the same look or finish as what I'm used to seeing. And then for your later ones, they're just going to be hardwood that's painted black instead of rosewood. But yeah, that's our Type 12s, 1942 to 1945. Really not a whole lot on them. Same features as the Type 11s. The only difference is they're just japanned instead of being nickel plated. The same casting is going to have to stand in as our Type 13. And we're talking 1945 to 1952. And the reason why I say that is because it's identical to the Type 12, except it's no longer Japan. It's now nickel plated again. Some maple knobs of this type are finished natural. Others are painted black. So it sounds like it's pretty much anybody's guess of what's going on really throughout this entire Type 10 through Type 14 period, where you never know what you're going to get with the knobs. But we're basically back to a very similar design to what we had on the Type 11s. It's just now we're nickel plating them again. We're on to Type 14, folks. This busted up, you know, sad case is standing in once again for the Type 14s. So I appreciate your flexibility on that. The biggest difference from Type 13s is the clamping device. The cutter clamping device has lost its fluting. So we now just have this smooth edges on the cutter clamping device. And the type study talks about the original instruction sheet was dated July 1953, and it illustrates this new cutter clamping device. The Type 14s ran from 1953 all the way to 1973. So for 20 years, they continued to pump out these routers, and they stayed, you know, pretty much the same, with one exception. Okay, technically it'd be two exceptions. One of them is the hardwood knobs were painted blue from 1960 to 1965, and that tracks because in the 60s, you know, Stanley had a tendency to paint things blue. It's the same thing with the Type 20s, which, as I recall, 1962 to 1967 were also blue. And then it does mention that some models of this type have a knurled design on the thumb screw that secures the cutter clamp. So I'm going to go ahead and go with that right there as the knurled design. Hopefully that shows up for you. For our Stanley planes, our Stanley router planes specifically, this is last and most certainly not least. But don't run off after this, because I'm going to talk about, I'm going to show you the Millers Falls router plane, or at least one of them. And then I'm going to talk briefly about the Sargent router plane as well. But for our Stanleys, this is it. This is our Type 15. And these little dudes were made in England. So we're talking 1974 to 1996. And basically what it says in the type study is that it's believed in about 1974 they started making the plane, the router plane, over in England, and it was only manufactured over there. But it's got all the same features as the Type 14, with the exception of it says made in England. I'm going to add one thing, and I'm going to say that a lot of times you're going to see these and they're going to have plastic knobs, which I don't know that if the ones produced here in America ever had plastic knobs, but some of the ones produced in England definitely did. So they weren't all wood. But if you were a woodworker in the 1980s and really even into the 1990s, you could go to Woodcraft and you could buy a brand new router plane right off the shelf. And I know this because I've actually seen the receipt from somebody who in the 90s went to Woodcraft and bought that. But, you know, still got the original box. I do have the lid for it somewhere, but it's not readily available. And, you know, these are the same as what we've been talking about for the later models. You got your 1/4 inch, you've got your 1/2 inch witch's tooth or V pointed blade, and then you've got your 1/2 inch square blade there. And, of course, the fence. And as promised, here is Millers Falls' answer. This was the number 67, and it's pretty much a blatant copy of the Stanley design, with not really much for exceptions. This one is a little bit bigger, meaning that the base of it is wider. So there they are side by side, so you can see exactly the difference there. But other than that, this dude is pretty much identical to the Stanley model in terms of its features. And I have seen an old Millers Falls catalog that showed that the early Millers Falls routers only came with 2 blades as well. So that's worth noting in case you're out there in the market for a number 67. I'm going to show you that Sargent router plane that I promised here in just a minute. But before we do, I'm going to talk briefly about the 71.5. So you remember all the way at the beginning we talked about how the original 71 was a closed throat router, and then we went to the open throat. Well, in 1896, Stanley decided to bring back the closed throat router, you know, probably to make more money. Stanley was into that back then. But since 71 had already been associated with the open throat router, what they did is they decided to just name this one the 71.5. But the 71.5, if you look in Walter's book, it does have its own type study, and that is worth looking into if you're into the 71.5s. Personally, I'm not a big fan. I like the 71s better, but if you're into that kind of thing, just know that there is a different type study for those, and they came back in 1896 as a separate product.
And here's the Sargent router that I was telling you all about. As you can see, they call it a number 62, made in New Haven, Connecticut. Looks very similar to the Stanley design. The most important thing to know about the Sargent routers is they have their own unique blade, so don't buy one of these thinking you can run a Stanley blade in it.
Just like always, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, clarifications, desired, whatever it might be, you know, come on into the comments and let me know what you got, and I will definitely try to answer them if I can.